Welcome to TYT. I'm your host, Anna Kasparian. I'm super excited for the show today because we will be having an interview in the first hour. A reporter from More Perfect Union named John Russel will be joining us. He is the gentleman who put together that incredible video at a Trump rally in Erie, Pennsylvania, where his whole point was to try to see if there's any common ground between progressives and Trump supporters. So we covered that pretty extensively last week. I absolutely loved what More Perfect Union did with that video. And John Russel, the reporter, will be joining us to kind of talk about not just that report, but I think a broader discussion, an important discussion that I think we need to have in regard to building the broad coalitions necessary to actually have a successful pressure campaign toward members of Congress to get the policies we need and want passed. So really looking forward to that conversation. We're also gonna talk a little bit about the police attempting to essentially arrest someone for simply flicking them off. You can't, offend the very sensitive feelings of police officers, apparently. So we'll get to that a little later in the first hour as well. In the second hour, David Schuster will be joining me to talk about a whole host of topics, including some of the unfortunate threats and doxing that members of the grand jury in Georgia are now dealing with following Trump's fourth indictment over his alleged election meddling. So we'll get to that as well. But before we get to all of that, just want to encourage you all to like and share the stream if you're watching us online on YouTube. You can also help support the show by becoming a member. Go to tyt.com/join to become one, or click on that join button if you're watching us on YouTube. We will be having a bonus episode today, as we do every day after the main show. And I'm looking forward to today's with David Schuster. I think this is the first time he and I have hosted together, just the two of us. So it's gonna be a lot of fun. All right, well, let's get to our first story. I wanted to give you some updates on what's transpiring in Maui following those devastating wildfires.
There's a lot of real estate speculation happening right now that is really frustrating. And I just want to remind all you real estate investors around the world, like Lahaina is not for sale. Please don't reach out to these families and take advantage of them during the most devastating time of our lives.
That's right. Unsurprisingly, speculators, scammers, and real estate developers are trying to cash in on the tragic conditions left behind by wildfires in Maui. We're gonna hear more from Lahaina resident Tiare Lawrence on that very issue in just a bit. But first, let's actually examine what local communities in Maui are grappling with in the aftermath of these devastating fires. So let's take a look at this video. You're watching drone footage from the Washington Post that shows some of the destruction left behind in Lahaina as of August 11th. And as you can see, most structures in the historic town are just completely destroyed. And the state's governor, Josh Green, expects that the cost of rebuilding will top an estimated $6 billion. In addition, the Maui Emergency Management Agency also estimated a similar price tag of $5.52 billion to rebuild in Maui County. Now, while property can be rebuilt, lost lives obviously cannot be brought back. And that's the most tragic part of this story. The death toll rose to 106 people as of this morning. But the number of victims is expected to rise further, considering there are still around 1,300 people missing. Now, identifying those who perished has also been a struggle, and officials are resorting to DNA evidence or DNA analysis to figure out who the remains belong to. They're just having a lot of difficulty identifying, the remains because of how badly, people were just. How badly people, how badly this fire killed people and just completely charred their remains. It's hard to even talk about it or think about it, but nonetheless, after facing some pressure, President Joe Biden announced that he does in fact plan to visit the area soon. And the federal government has already provided some aid to those in need. So for instance, FEMA has made nearly $2 million in payments to about 1,200 survivors as of Tuesday. But about 3,400 people have applied for assistance, said Keith Turry, the Deputy Associate Administrator for Response and Recovery. But here's the real question. This is the important question. Will the federal aid and the home insurance payouts be enough for the residents to rebuild their homes and begin to piece together their lives? There's understandably deep concern about that, especially as these vultures are swooping in to reap the benefits of exploiting this tragedy. Now, Lahaina resident Tiare Lawrence expressed frustration over developers who have already begun reaching out to victims with pretty transactional objectives. Let's watch.
Homeowners have been reached out by investors and realtors offering to buy their land. And this is disgusting, and we just want to make sure that people around the world understand our situation and know that Lahaina is not for sale. It is important that the multi-generational families that come from Lahaina get to continue to live in our hometown. We need to work as a community to ensure that we have a seat at the table on how our town is rebuilt and what that looks like. And it's important that we make sure that the cultural history of Lahaina, the integrity of Lahaina is protected, especially for Native Hawaiian families from Lahaina. We, as a Native Hawaiian community, we've already been displaced so much. You know, the cost of living in Hawaii is so high. Your median house goes for $1 million. So, you know, already dealing with that and having an affordable housing crisis, and now this just really scares me and concerns me that there'll be more Native Hawaiian displacement happening on our among our community.
I agree with her. I mean, the exploitation that typically takes place following these types of tragedies and disasters is disgusting. And guess what? This isn't the first time speculators have swooped in after a devastating natural disaster. The practice, in fact, is so common that Naomi Klein refers to it as disaster capitalism. For example, Floridians who lost their homes in Fort Myers due to Hurricane Ian last September were informed that, those insurance payouts wouldn't cover the rising costs necessary to rebuild. This partly due to federal rules mandating that the rebuilt homes follow modern flood and wind building codes, which obviously can be exorbitant. Now, left with no choice, many of the residents have just given up. They're deciding to sell the land that their homes once stood on to these developers. Politico analyzed real estate transaction data from that area, and here's what they found. First, storms like Ian wreck the homes. Then shrinking insurance markets, government rules designed to limit future risk, and still hot demand for housing combined to make some of their communities unaffordable, to say the least. Now, homeowners who want to rebuild often have to pay much of the cost on their own because the federal flood insurance program caps payouts at $250,000 per home, far below coastal areas' market values. By the way, far below the market value in most markets. Let's just keep it real. And the actual insurance payments after Ian were even lower. And so normal working class people are getting pushed out of the community because they simply cannot afford the cost of rebuilding. And that includes retirees, teachers, firefighters, and other people of modest means. It's a perfect opportunity for disaster capitalists. In the fourth quarter of 2022, just after Ian, more than 90% of all sales in Fort Myers were completed without a mortgage, in a sign that all cash buyers were dominating the market. That was at least 10 percentage points higher than the previous all cash peak in early 2009. So these are obviously moneyed interests, institutional investors, speculators. The buyers, according to the transaction data, include people and corporations who clearly can afford to pay $1 million or more in cash. And let me just say, ordinary people can't afford to pay for a home worth $1 million or more in cash. 91 vacant lot sales in Fort Myers Beach, listed on Zillow for May of 2021 through the end of last month, found that 6 of the 9 most expensive transactions in price per square foot came after Ian, with multiple sales exceeding 2.5 million and one fetching 3.2 million. 50 of those sales occurred during the 9 months since Hurricane Ian basically devastated the area. Now, one example is 69-year-old Catherine Light, who decided to sell the land where her powder blue cottage once stood. A real estate developer bought the now vacant lot for $525,000, which, was nearly 4 times what she and her husband had paid in the mid-1990s. But while that might seem like a nice return on investment, there's no way she could ever afford to live in a beach community in Florida again due to rapidly rising housing costs. In fact, considering how high interest rates are, I would be surprised if she was even sure she wanted to take out a mortgage to afford a new home once she relocates. In fact, she told Politico, quote, "The whole beach," meaning Fort Myers Beach, "is going to change completely. The people that could afford to live there in the beach cottages and stuff, they're gone." And understandably, that's exactly what the people of Maui and Lahaina specifically are worried about. Luckily, Hawaii's governor, Josh Green, is considering implementing rules that would prevent speculators from cashing in on this tragedy. The governor, Josh Green, said he had reached out to the state's attorney general to discuss a moratorium on property sales in Lahaina. Maui had been facing a serious housing crunch and unaffordable prices even before being hit by the deadliest fire in the US in over a century. Green said he didn't want to see the remains of Lahaina snapped up by developers. And I commend him for that. In fact, here's more from Green during his press conference with the mayor of Maui.
I would caution people that it's going to be a very long time before any growth or housing can be built. And so you will be pretty poorly informed if you try to steal land from our people and then build here.
Governor Green even elaborated on other ways the state plans on helping the wildfire victims in Hawaii, especially as these developers are trying to goad them into selling their land.
We will be embedding attorneys who are going to work pro bono for our people, Maui attorneys for Maui's people, to be at our joint response centers available to all of us. So if people have someone reach out to them to try to get their land, we will be able to get expert legal advice so that doesn't happen. If someone behaves in a predatory fashion towards one of the people that are suffering right now, who have lost their loved ones or lost their home, lost their rental, and they try to buy land out from under them, you can be sure I will not be allowing anyone to build or rezone or do anything of that sort if they've taken advantage of anyone here.
And keep the statement about preventing rezoning in mind as we continue to give you details about this story. Because look, it's great that the local community applied enough pressure to ensure that the governor is actually, looking out for them, and they deserve the opportunity to rebuild. And the thought of moneyed interest taking advantage of this devastation makes me absolutely sick. But look, as climate change continues to create the extreme conditions that exacerbate these natural disasters and make them much more destructive, there needs to be, more done to ensure that the onus and financial burdens are not placed on ordinary citizens. In fact, the industries that have led us to this unstable and dystopian era should be the ones footing the bill, not the taxpayers. Fossil fuel companies and their lucrative business practices basically allowed them to hoard resources and that got us into this mess in the first place. And since they've reaped the financial rewards for doing so, I think it's time for them to pay up. Whatever Josh Green or any other governor in any other state does after these types of natural disasters is simply a band-aid. It's simply dealing with the symptoms of a much bigger issue. And we need to tackle that issue at the root cause. It would definitely have a better response to the very real climate emergency, and it would prevent ordinary people and taxpayers from having to foot the bill after these devastating losses occur. Now, with that said, I do want to read a quick comment from one of our members in the Twitch community. This is from Wee Duncan, who has been a subscriber for 32 months. And this comment is really important, okay? So Wee Duncan says, "Aloha, Casper, mahalo for leading with the Maui story. Many homes were built on land owned by others as leasehold tenants. So that means that you might own the home, but the land that the home is on doesn't belong to you, right? It belongs to another individual. And so here's the concern. The fear is the major landowners will not rebuild small homes, but major resorts. And look, in order for them to be able to do that, that land would need to be rezoned. And as you heard the Governor Green, mention in one of the videos, he claims that he is going to prevent the rezoning of these lands especially if it shows that it's going to hurt the residents who have pretty much lost their homes as a result of these wildfires. Just make sure that you ensure that he stays true to his promise there. But I think that that is definitely another addition to the concerns that the local community has in Maui. These are legitimate concerns. The one silver lining here is, for the first time following this kind of natural disaster, you have local politicians essentially saying, no, we're gonna do what we need to do to protect the local community. We just got to make sure that they hold true to that promise and that they're held accountable should they stray from that promise. But my heart goes out to the local community. We are going to continue updating you all on the aftermath of these devastating fires. And if you have any way to reach out to people in Maui, donate resources to them, please do so. It's just absolutely devastating and heartbreaking to see them go through what they're going through right now. For now, though, we're gonna take a quick break, and when we come back, John Russel will be joining us to talk about that incredible More Perfect Union report that he did last week, trying to show that there could be some common ground among progressives and, yes, even members of the MAGA community. That and more coming up, don't miss it. Welcome back to TYT. I'm your host, Anna Kasparian, and we're about to get to an incredible interview. But before we do, I just wanted to read 2 super chats having to do with the segment I just covered in regard to real estate speculators coming into Maui to look to buy up some of the land and property there. Now, Frank Rockefeller says, property owners in disaster areas perceive the value of their house contextually. Risky property is going to involve profit and loss evaluations. Well, Frank, the one thing I just want you to be completely aware of is that if you are under the impression that there are some parts of the country that are safer from the impacts of the climate emergency, whereas other areas are much more risky, you would be mistaken. So in fact, I mean, you have insurers, home insurers, pulling out of several states at this point, California and Florida being among those states. In California, they don't want to provide coverage for the loss of homes as a result of wildfires. In Florida, they're concerned about flooding. Every single part of this country in some way has been impacted by the climate emergency. The question is, what will the response to that be? What will we do to mitigate the impact of climate change and respond to it in a way that makes sense? But more importantly, when are we gonna stop, shifting the financial burden onto ordinary people when these fossil fuel companies have gotten away with murder, when they have privatized the gains and socialized the losses? It's unacceptable. That is where the emphasis needs to be right now. Placing the onus on people who have just experienced the tragedy they've experienced in Maui makes no sense to me. Caroline Roberts writes in and says, I lost my home to a flood in 2006. FEMA gave me $1,300. And the Red Cross gave me cleaning supplies. I had a young child, and that was the help we got. I hope FEMA is better to the people of Maui. I certainly hope so too. As I mentioned in that segment, they've already given out about $2 million to individuals who have applied for aid from FEMA. When the terrible earthquake in Northridge happened when I was a kid back in 1994, I remember FEMA was pretty good about helping our community out. But it really is hit or miss, and it really does depend on who's in control of Congress and whether or not the party in control is funding FEMA the way it needs to be funded in order to give out the aid people need after these kinds of tragedies. But anyway, thank you to everyone who's writing in. I really appreciate everyone's perspective, even the perspectives of those who provide some constructive feedback. Thank you. But for now, why don't we move on to our next segment, something I'm very excited to share with you.
So here's my hunch. For all the focus on culture war issues, the working class on the left and the right have a lot more in common than we're led to believe. And if that's true, it could and should have huge implications for the upcoming presidential election. So I went to Erie, Pennsylvania to find out.
In partnership with More Perfect Union, reporter John Russel went to a Trump rally in Erie, Pennsylvania to see if there's any possible common ground among the left and basically the MAGA crowd. And I absolutely loved the report. We covered it extensively on the show last week. It was amazing to see just how thoughtful these voters happen to be, as long as the reporter, actually decides to ask some important questions on issues that go beyond the culture wars. And I do want to share some of my favorite moments from that report, just in case you all missed it. Let's take a look.
There's so many houses for sale in our neighborhood. I was going to go to town and say, are these all, can we find out, are these just real people buying them, or is this like proxies? See, BlackRock proxies, Vanguard proxies. Are they buying all these homes so people can't own them and they're just going to rent them?
Would you be excited if Trump did anything to rein in?
Well, of course. It's just...
It's a monopoly that needs to be broken up. Just like, remember the telephone company in the 80s, AT&T, right. That was broken up.
Yeah.
And that's what needs to be done.
Capitalism's not the problem. It's been corrupted to such a level, just like people think all the politicians are corrupted. But it's corrupted at the highest levels of these corporations, like you said, being owned. Instead of 200 of them, you're down to 4. Yeah. That's a massive control.
Joining us now is John Russel, who actually did the report for More Perfect Union and describes himself as an Appalachian dive bartender and eater of the rich. He's also a writer over at Substack, and you should follow his Substack and labor-related topics. It's called The Holler. And John, thank you so much for joining us, but more importantly, thank you for doing that report. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Anna. I'm excited to join the show.
It's good to have you. I have so many questions for you. I'm gonna start off by asking if you received any backlash at all for the report that you did.
Really, it was surprisingly little backlash. I mean, the YouTube comment section can go south in a hurry, but I think it was pretty positive, and I think that just speaks to the fact that people all feel like we're in this painful stagnation, regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum, and there's a large appetite out there to get out of it.
Absolutely. I mean, I certainly feel that appetite, and just to share where I'm coming from, just full disclosure. I look back at especially the last 6 years. I look at the Trump administration and the way the left has kind of responded to it. And I feel that we might need to really reconsider our strategy. And what you did in that report touches on something that increasingly seems to be the best strategy in order to build coalitions necessary to get the policies we want accomplished. So let's back up a little bit. Tell me a little bit about yourself and how you came up with this idea to go to a Trump rally and ask questions that you typically do not see journalists asking these, the MAGA crowd.
Well, I mean, the first thing that came to mind is just the quality of the interviews that were coming out at these Trump rallies. I mean, most of the videos are just kind of farming for clicks or profiting off of clicks, picking out the most ridiculous interviews and painting this picture of the worst examples of 80 million Americans, right? And to me, just to back up and tell you about myself, I grew up in the Ohio Valley. It is the heart of the Rust Belt, right? The place where NAFTA still means something and is still very fresh. I worked at a dive bar here, and I am a very open leftist. I make no bones about that. And when you work in a bar in a county where the county voted for Trump by 71%, and you don't hide your politics, you're gonna have those conversations. But as I did over a year, those conversations went pretty well because we kept them class-based. And something I wanna talk about here too, you can't have class-based politics without getting people over the hump of all of the divisive issues, things that are usually exploited, race, gender, religion, getting over those and showing people that you need the person that's different than you as much as they need you to actually get something done. As a working class coalition, you have to get over those things. And I was having those kind of conversations in the bar, and I wanted to take those up and see if they held up at the Trump rally. And I was pleased to find out what we had when we went up.
I was definitely pleased as well. I mean, it was a relief to hear a voter on the other side of the aisle show just how aware he is of what the private equity firms are up to, what BlackRock is up to in regard to the real estate market and how it's pricing ordinary people out of residential real estate. I mean, it's a side of the MAGA crowd that you just don't see in the press. And I think for a very specific reason, specifically because it would force them to touch on class politics. And class politics, I think, unites us, whereas a lot of the culture war narratives, and especially the way they're covered and how they play out in the press, only divides us. And of course, they get their cues, in my opinion, from politicians in both parties, right? And so I want to kind of share my thesis with you, and I want to get your thoughts on that, because I've increasingly started to believe that with the Citizens United ruling and with moneyed interests basically filling the coffers of politicians on both sides of the aisle, you essentially have two parties that are increasingly similar when it comes to the substantive bread and butter issues, the economic issues. And I feel that the way they try to differentiate themselves from one another, right, the left versus right in the political landscape, is to really lean into the culture war stuff. And most of it is messaging. I think most of it is performative, right? You'll hear Democrats claim that they want to protect the lives and improve the lives of marginalized communities. But then when you actually look at the policies, there's much to be desired. The right wing has always been pretty mask off when it comes to how protectionist they are when it comes to traditional values and things like that. So none of that surprises me. But there's a lot of theater going on right now among our politicians in regard to culture war issues to just kind of provide the illusion of governance, when in reality, there's actually a lot of agreement between those two sides when it comes to economic policies and essentially providing cover for corporate interests and corporate greed. Maybe I'm being a little harsh in the way that I'm analyzing this, but I am curious what you think about it.
Yeah, no, I think you nailed what's happening here. And it's just no surprise across the political spectrum. When you go up and you talk to people like a human being, you find out that even folks in line at a Trump rally, you might not expect them to talk with you and say, hey, my healthcare doesn't cover anything. I am paying hundreds of dollars out of pocket per month and thousands of dollars before my healthcare ever kicks in to fix anything that's wrong with me. We watched, one person lose $200 billion and still be the second richest man on earth. People are looking out at the same reality here. I mean, Maui's on fire. You can see in New York City, right? And they're saying, who's really benefiting from all of this? Why can't we seem to get any response out of our political system? Those feelings, they're alive and well on the left and on the right. And if we want to unite around those, I think we have to break out of the generic politics that's offered to us by candidates and by legacy media. If you tuned into Fox or CNN, you're going to have one view of what people think up there that doesn't necessarily, isn't grounded in reality. And I think where that gets really interesting is where you start to ask people, what do we do about this? Our political system is not responding, right? So we had really good conversations. Instead of looking to make change in the political space, we asked, why don't we make change in the workplace? Mm-hmm. The political space is not responding, but you saw UPS workers standing in the hundreds of thousands strong, and that solidarity around class won them a contract that has $30 billion cash in hand in the pocket. When we talked with Trump voters about that, they were down for it. Mm-hmm. They were supportive. they didn't always necessarily know about it because it doesn't show up on the legacy media. But when we went up there and we talked about these things, you can clearly see, I mean, this is one Trump rally and a few interviews, but even with that, it is obvious that there are a pile of political chips being left on the table here that are the raw materials for working class solidarity that can win in the workplace. And I think if we organize around that, the political power that flows from being organized in the workplace, from being surrounded by people who are different than you, but all fighting the boss together to improve your life, that is something that could change our politics overnight. And it was reflected up there in the rallies.
Just to buttress your point, I want to, just provide some polling data in regard to how Americans overall feel about some of these economic issues. Let's start with a Vox poll. So a Vox Data for Progress poll back in 2021 found that a whopping 71% of the respondents support raising the taxes of the wealthiest 2% of Americans, while a Reuters poll from 2020 found that 64% support a wealth tax, a slight increase from a 2019 Brookings poll that found that 61% support, taxing the rich. In addition to that, the Vox poll from that year found, or last year I should say, found 50% support for taxing the rich among Republicans specifically, right? And so just based on this poll, based on the reporting and the answers that the Trump supporters gave in the report that you put out there, based on the way voters overwhelmingly rejected issue 1 in the state of Ohio, in your state, based on the ballot measure that voters in Florida overwhelmingly supported to increase the state's minimum wage to $15 an hour. Like, in case after case, you see common ground among Americans across the political spectrum, regardless of where they fall on that political spectrum. And those issues are typically the bread and butter issues that lead to some economic stability for these folks. And what you just mentioned about the workplace and how important an organized workplace is to building the coalitions we need, but also having an outside pressure campaign that's successful enough to influence the politicians to actually work for us as opposed to corporate interests, in order to improve the conditions in the workplace, your immediate conditions. All of that stuff is super important. All of those conversations, I believe, are being intentionally left out in corporate media, and instead, there's a lot of focus on what makes us different from one another, why we should be scared of one another based on what our identity is. And so that's my long setup to ask you, how do we approach this strategy of building a broad coalition of people based on these similar economic interests, without leaving behind the concerns of people who have experienced racism, sexism, transphobia, homophobia? Those are real concerns. And I think that what ends up getting kind of left behind in their minds as we talk about this strategy is what their concerns are and how these marginalized communities have been treated historically and currently in America. What is your answer to that?
I think we have a lot to learn from labor history that has been, deliberately swept under the rug, kept out of textbooks. I am a minute away from Wheeling, West Virginia here, and we have a long history of dealing with exactly this that you may not have heard about, but it goes back to the workplace. I think if you want to meeting people where they are is always going to be messy, right? We have had a 50-year right-wing propaganda effort that's been financed by billions of dollars that is engineered to divide people on race and gender lines. How do you fight back against that? Get everybody in the same boat on class-based issues and fight a common enemy together. And if you have to work to survive in this country, if you can't afford to skip work, then you are all in the working class. Okay, so we have a very small and powerful elite, group of super rich people who are calling the shots, there's your common enemy. The workplace is where it takes place. And what can that teach us from history? Well, in the 1900s in West Virginia, coal miners here were taking an oath to join the UMWA, to never discriminate against a fellow worker on the basis of race or religion or gender or otherwise. There's all kinds of history of labor organizing and union organizing. I mean, farm equipment workers in the 1940s were marching to integrate the towns in Kentucky where they worked. They were electing Black leadership. They had multiracial coalitions that were marching to integrate towns in the South 20 years before Dr. King marched on Washington. The roots of multiracial solidarity are right here for us to pick up and work with, and they can sell in the Rust Belt. And we should get back to that, because if you're going to stay united, if you're going to win on class issues, then you do have to address everything that you brought up. Racism, transphobia, homophobia. Those are the first things that the powerful interests are going to try to pick off and divide your class unity with. So when you're trying to make a win like that, class politics necessarily means that you're going to have to show people with differences in the same boat that you all need each other as much as the next person. And unlike politics, that is unresponsive and kind of abstract to everybody. It's just entertainment now. The workplace is immediate, it's every day. And the wins that you get there are tangible, okay? My own kind of editorializing here is that I think a lot of what goes into this Trump movement is very intense opinions that are loosely held. I mean, politics, we all look at it and we think it's set in stone. But Donald Trump, we all remember a time where it wasn't possible for him to become president. Same thing with Barack Obama. These things can change overnight. So I don't buy that this whole, millions of people, yes, there's definitely intense opinions on some of this. Like I said, it's gonna be messy when you go to meet people where they are. But how strongly those are set in stone, I'm not sold on. And I think one of the best things to fight back against that is to organize in the workplace where you have to fight these issues out and remain together if you're gonna get anything done.
Totally agree with you, and I'm so happy that you're saying this. I'm happy with the work that you're doing. It's incredibly important and honestly principled and difficult to do, especially in the current climate that we're in. Like, I just know from personal experience, the whole ongoing debate between class essentialism and race essentialism. It's frustrating because I do think that the most intersectional group of people in the country are workers, so we're improving working conditions overwhelmingly improves the conditions of these marginalized communities. But I want to end with a quick video from a YouTuber by the name of Devin Gibson. Wasn't familiar with him, he is a conservative, but he saw your report and here's his reaction to it.
This is probably one of the best all-around civil discussions between liberals and conservatives that I've ever seen. I mean, that was gooder than chicken right there. This guy, I think John Russel was his name. He did an outstanding job. And shout out to More Perfect Union, the channel over on YouTube as well, for putting this video together and going out there and doing what a lot of people aren't willing to do in this day and age. They're not willing to sit down, have discussions about how we can all really unite and really improve and thrive as a country. Remember, this America, United States of America, is supposed to be about we the people. But nowadays we got the media, the politicians, these forces that be, these powers that be, all about greed, all about smoke and mirrors and pinning us against each other, dividing and conquering, talking about and making up issues along the way to try to deter our attention from what they really got going on behind closed doors.
So congratulations, John. You just got a conservative to give a shout out to More Perfect Union, and I'm here for it. I love it. It's so good.
Let me say one thing to add on to that, and this is one of the biggest pushback things we got there. Obviously, it is much easier for someone who looks like me, generic white guy with a mullet, to break through to this guy wearing an American flag and a cross. But this reaching out like that is a job for people who look like me. I mean, that's about the only job that I should be doing. We shouldn't be burdening people of color to reach out to those who are very far down the pipeline. But it is possible to do. You just saw it, and we need a lot more of it.
Totally agree. John, I appreciate you. Thank you so much for being generous with your time and joining us here at TYT. I hope you keep doing this excellent work, and I hope to talk to you again in the future.
Thanks a lot, Anna. Thanks for having me on.
For sure. All right, everyone, we're gonna take a brief break, and when we come back, we've got a lot more news to get to, including some post-election analysis in regard to issue 1 in Ohio. Wanted to give you an update on that because the demographic of voters who rejected it, real important to know about as we move forward. And I also wanna talk about the Democratic Party deciding to have pretty questionable figure lead the Democratic National Convention. Her ties to various moneyed interests and corporations should be alarming to anyone who actually cares about a Democratic Party that isn't beholden to corporate interests. So that and more coming up. Don't miss it. We'll be right back. Moondragon writes in our Twitch community and says, happy Mooniversary. Anna, you are salty strong today as usual. Moondragon, thank you for being a member for 2 years. We appreciate you. And everyone else who's watching who isn't a member, you can become one by clicking on that join button if you're watching us on YouTube. You can also become a member by going to tyt.com/join. All right, I wanted to do a quick update on the outcome of issue 1 in Ohio. This was a story I covered last Wednesday to basically make a point about how we needed Republican voters to join Democrats in rejecting issue 1. And now we have a little more information about the extent to which Republicans helped us out by rejecting issue 1. Okay, so let's talk about that. Defeating issue 1 in Ohio, a ballot measure that would have made it much harder to amend the state's constitution to include, protections for reproductive rights and abortion. And it would have also made it incredibly difficult to include ballot measures on the ballot to begin with. Well, we wouldn't be able to get to where we are today, the utter rejection of issue 1, without the help of Republican voters in the state of Ohio. Now that was the thesis of a segment I did just last week, but we didn't have all the details yet. The analysis of the demographics and how they voted had not been done yet. Well, that analysis has taken place, and I am happy to report that the situation's actually much better than I had even shared with you earlier. So about 57% of the state voted against issue 1. Again, issue 1 was an undemocratic measure. It would have required a supermajority in order to amend the state's constitution. This was really a proxy battle for abortion rights because they want to include a ballot measure in November of 2024 that would amend the state constitution to include protection for abortion rights. It appears that about 57% of the state wants that amendment, which is why Republican lawmakers in the state pushed for issue 1, which would require that supermajority of 60% in order to amend the state constitution. This was their way of nipping it in the bud and ensuring that there wouldn't be a state constitutional right to abortion. Now, here's the outcome. Like I said, 57% of the state voted against issue 1. Ohio, as you all know, is a red state, which means there are definitely Republicans voting against issue 1, which is great news, common ground. Well, here are the details. Biden counties around cities voted against changing the rules to amend the state constitution, but they were joined by suburban counties in the state that went for Trump. In total, 22 Ohio counties voted against amending the state constitution. All of them are around larger cities and college towns, and most of them are suburban and exurban counties that voted for Trump in 2020. There also seems to be a difference between MAGA Republicans and non-MAGA Republicans in the state and how they, not necessarily how they voted. I think that there's a distinction between how they voted on issue 1 and how they respond to pollsters. So for instance, among MAGA supporters, 80% of them, according to these polls, say that they approve of overturning Roe. But among non-MAGA voters, only 51% say they approve in a poll that reported a margin of sampling error of plus or minus 4.38 percentage points. Okay, so this is to say that they might respond one way to the polling, but once push comes to shove and the impact of banning abortion is real for them, all of a sudden they vote a little differently, right? And that was definitely something that played out with issue 1 in Ohio. Now, Ohio isn't alone in this pattern of having like basically Republican voters support ballot initiatives that Democratic voters want. So I want to give you a few other examples. So apparently last year, 6 states had abortion measures on the ballot, 3 that aimed to codify or expand abortion rights, and 3 were designed to restrict them. And in each case, the side that favored abortion rights won out. So Kansas, there was the vote on an amendment to essentially remove abortion as a right from the state constitution. We all remember how that played out, right? Kansas, not a blue state. Kansas, very much a red state. So how did this all play out? Well, in 2020, Biden won only 5 counties around Kansas City, Topeka, and Lawrence and Manhattan, and the state's 2 big college towns, okay? Or the state's 2 big college towns. Now in total, 90 counties voted no last year, meaning that the counties who overwhelmingly supported Donald Trump over Biden voted to protect abortion rights in their state. So do we accept the common ground here or do we just reject it? Right? Like this is the point that I'm trying to make. When there are areas of common ground, take the win. And try to understand that, yes, there are gonna be areas of disagreement for sure, but where we can work together to win, we should work together to win. And that's exactly what's happening in some of these states. There was also Michigan. There was a referendum last year that made abortion a right in the state constitution. In 2020, Biden won 11 counties in Michigan. Last year, the proposal to codify abortion rights won in all those counties, as well as in suburban counties around Detroit, Kalamazoo, and Lansing. All told, 26 counties voted for the measure. There are areas of common ground. We need to take those wins where we can get it. And I'm really happy to see what the outcome of issue 1 was in Ohio. Super happy to see that these ballot initiatives are continuing to surprise us with results that, if you just base your worldview on how legacy media reports on these issues, you would believe that like there's no way that these kinds of ballot measures are gonna work in states that are considered red states. But these shockers keep coming one after another, and I hope they continue to. I'm just trying to get you guys to see the other perspective, the areas of common ground, when there's just this endless media deluge of reports about how divided and polarized we are, how much we all hate each other. Not necessarily the case when it comes to some of these issues. Let's move on to what the Democratic Party is up to as the election heats up and they start picking and choosing who gets leadership roles with things like the Democratic National Convention. Last week, a woman by the name of Minion Moore, a principal at a public affairs and consulting firm known as Dewey Square Group, or DSG, as I'm gonna call it throughout the rest of the segment, was announced as the chair of the 2024 Democratic National Convention. Pretty big deal. Now, I mentioned DSG, or Dewey Square Group, because of her involvement in it and what that actually means. Because while the Democratic Party still loves to present itself and market itself as the party that looks out for the little guy, for ordinary workers in America, actions certainly speak louder than words, and they keep choosing leadership that has very cozy ties to corporate interests, okay? So Moore is a longtime party insider. She's currently a co-chair of the DNC Rules and Bylaws Committee, and she was also CEO of the DNC back in 2001. Now, her consulting firm, okay, DSG, has had some clients that, really like to work against labor in various states. And I wanna give you some specific examples, beginning with Lyft in Massachusetts. Lyft happened to be one of DSG's clients, and they spent quite a bit of money to lobby against workers in the state of Massachusetts. So last year, DSG scored an 8-figure payday from Lyft as part of a Massachusetts campaign regarding the classification of app-based workers, so gig workers. What the apps want to do is essentially classify these workers not as employees, but as private contractors. And the reason why they want to do that is so they can avoid having to provide benefits, healthcare benefits, for instance, to these workers. Now, Lyft and other companies launched a public influence campaign supporting a proposed Massachusetts ballot initiative that would classify app-based drivers as independent contractors, among other policies. Lyft contributed $14 billion to the state group backing the initiative in what the Boston Globe called the largest political donation ever in Massachusetts. Now, a study done by UC Berkeley kind of looked into what this ballot initiative would do if it passes for these gig economy workers, okay? And the UC Berkeley study found this. It said that 5 loopholes in the proposition would cut into workers' wages. They estimated drivers and riders working a typical 15-hour work week would only make $4.82 per hour after costs, while those working a 40-hour work week would make $6.74 an hour, which I don't think I need to tell you guys, that is obviously even lower than the current abysmal federal minimum wage of $7.25. And by the way, that UC Berkeley study is right on the nose because a similar proposition passed in the state of California, Prop 22 back in 2020. And it was devastating for those working in the gig economy. So I was really happy to find what the fate of this proposition in Massachusetts ended up being. I'll tell you what that is in just a moment, but let's go back to the Dewey Square Group, Minion Moore's consulting firm, and how they played a role in all of this. So apparently DSG got a lot of that industry money in support of the measure. The Lyft-funded group named Flexibility and Benefits for Massachusetts Drivers paid DSG nearly $10.6 million in 2 payments in August and September last year, according to state data from the Office of Campaign and Political Finance, making DSG by far its top vendor. So this consulting firm that the now head of the Democratic National Convention is part of, okay? She's the principal at this consulting firm. Worked against workers, viciously worked against workers in the state of Massachusetts, in cahoots with DSG. DSG was doing their dirty deeds for them. But luckily, last summer, a Massachusetts court threw out the measure and prevented it from appearing on ballots. So the fate of the measure ended up being excellent, but the reason why I'm sharing these details with you is, again, the person chosen to head the Democratic National Convention and all the organizing around it, all the planning around it, is the principal at this consulting firm that works on behalf of these moneyed interests and against the interests of ordinary Americans, ordinary workers. I've got more for you. Let's talk a little bit about the restaurant industry and DSG's involvement with the restaurant industry. So Dewey Square Group has other clients, like McDonald's, for instance. As of its most recent political disclosure last year, McDonald's was a member of the trade group, the National Restaurant Association, which is now leading the battle against a California labor law, the FAST Act, signed last year by Governor Gavin Newsom on Labor Day. Now, the FAST Act is a priority for unions, for workers' unions. It would establish or has established a 10-member fast food council to oversee working conditions in fast food chains. And it is also expected to increase wages for fast food workers. But it is now being challenged by a statewide ballot measure, which is expected to be on the ballot in November of 2024. Now, DSG, that's Minion Moore's consulting firm, has a history of helping the restaurant association out with these kinds of measures. DSG has also worked for the National Restaurant Association as it opposed legislation guaranteeing sick leave for workers and the pro-union Employee Free Choice Act. In 2009, DSG was paid $772,110 by the National Restaurant Association, according to The Intercept. And they have other questionable clients as well, okay? So what are those questionable clients? Biodiesel companies. So let's talk about that. In 2017, Dewey Square Group received almost $1.2 million from the National Biodiesel Board, and in 2019 and 2021, DSG received another $1.5 million from the Biodiesel Group for consulting. Now, the issue with that is, biodiesel has been linked to, basically cutting down trees, deforestation in order to use the land as farmland in order to, essentially create the biodiesel, right? So it's actually linked to climate change. And this group that this woman, Minion Moore, is part of, the principal of, is essentially fighting on behalf of this industry, along with other corporate interests, right? Finally, let's get to the creme de la creme, the private healthcare industry, because this consulting firm also did a lot of work for them. For instance, since 2013, DSG has spent nearly $2.5 million for the Tenet Healthcare Hospital company in lobbying Massachusetts on nurse-safe staffing requirements and other issues. So the hospital industry has been fighting legislation in the state that has sought to cap the number of patients that nurses can be assigned to at a given time, going back to a bill that passed in 2014, applying a cap for nurses in intensive care units, which makes a lot of sense, right? Nurses are burnt out, healthcare workers are burnt out, understandably so, as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. Many of them have an unmanageable workload with an unmanageable number of patients that they have to provide care for. And so the nurses unions want to make sure that they have a cap to, by the way, not just look out for the nurses, but also ensure that the patients are getting an adequate quality of care. But the healthcare companies, the private hospital companies, they don't like that because they don't want to have to hire more nurses. They just want to take the nurses they have and just load them up with as many patients as they possibly can. And so they have DSG Group essentially work on their behalf in scrapping any policies that could cap the number of patients that these nurses have. In 2021 and 2022, Tenet Healthcare was engaged in a 10-month standoff against the nurses union at St. Vincent Hospital in Worcester, which the company owns, as nurses stayed on strike to demand a series of changes, including nurse-to-patient ratios. Following the strike, Tenet partnered with the anti-union National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation to attempt to have the union decertified. But the hospital nurses voted in March of 2022 to preserve their union. And guess what? There's more. DSG is linked to yet another client. In 2021, DSG began lobbying for Molina Healthcare on a senior care program in the state. The Fortune 500 company is a member of healthcare industry lobbying group America's Health Insurance Plans, AHIP, which during Biden's first year in office proposed a public health, or I should say opposed, not proposed. They opposed a public health insurance option, which is probably part of the reason why we haven't really heard much from Biden about a public option, something he campaigned for, something he ran on, and then immediately forgot about as soon as he was elected into office. So look, I give you all this information to say, when the Democratic Party is puzzled by ordinary Americans turning their backs on them, refusing to vote for them, And they don't understand why, because they love to market themselves as the party that looks out for the little guy. Just understand that people aren't stupid. And when you go out of your way to name individuals who have these massive conflicts of interest, I mean, Minion Moore being in bed with these corporate interests as a result of being a principal over at this consulting firm, that is the kind of conflict of interest that should have raised red flags for the Democratic Party. Hey, maybe we don't want this woman to be the person, leading the Democratic National Convention, especially at a time when you have Joe Biden trying to present himself as FDR, right? He took advantage of Marjorie Greene comparing him to FDR, used her own words in a political ad to boast about how he's being compared to FDR. But you actually have to look out for the workers to do that, and optics also matter. So maybe take a good hard look at the leadership in the party. Maybe take a good hard look at the people that you're in bed with and question whether or not it makes sense to work alongside people who have a financial interest in working against ordinary workers in this country. I think that's super important for the Democratic Party. Hopefully they realize that. My guess is they won't, but we'll see. I just don't understand how they can have all of these issues with all of these various people. It's not just Minion Moore. I mean, look at Biden's cabinet. It is full to the brim with individuals who worked as consultants, had think tanks prior to the Biden administration. And take a look at who their clients are. And when you take a look at who their clients are, you have to ask yourself, who are these individuals actually looking out for? Is it the American people? Or is it the moneyed interests that they worked with and represented as clients before the administration? Just something to think about. Anyway, we got to take a break. When we come back, David Schuster will be joining me for the second hour, and we'll talk a little bit about, basically cops trying to arrest a man for flipping them off. That and more coming up.
Thanks for listening to the full episode of The Young Turks. Support our work, listen ad-free, access members-only bonus content, and more by subscribing to Apple Podcasts at apple.co/TYT. I'm your host, Cenk Uygur, and I'll see you soon.